Good morning, everyone in Africa and Europe and this part of the world. Good evening for those in Asia Pacific, and good, whatever it's good, whatever it's in currently in Americas. And today, I'm very privileged to have you today with us, Mish Middelmann. You've been mentoring and teaching most of the ORSC graduates in Africa and the Middle East. Nobody literally in ORSC here in the region doesn't know Mish and wasn't trained by Mish or wasn't mentored by Mish. We have some similarities, from starting from a technical background, but you were there as a CEO for a company that's developing software and actually switched early on to systemic coaching and leadership. And I'm really impressed when I met you 2 years back. I had this great impression that you're somebody that I have to really put my knees down on the floor and just sit and learn from. And actually, this is maybe the second encounter or the third encounter we had since we met the first time. But I'm really, really very glad and excited to have you today to talk about systemic leadership. And it's really the title that comes in with, how I know you, and this is my perspective. So welcome, Mish, to this show and to this live interview. And I'll just leave the floor for you to welcome everybody and say good morning to everyone.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And to be honest, I appreciate all the knee stuff, but it feels like we're sitting in chairs together and having the same kind of lovely chat that we had in Cairo a couple of years ago. And really, to everybody else who's here, the same. Just a really wonderful opportunity to be connected with you. And thank you so much for joining us. These are really important subjects about our lives, about our businesses, about our world. And it's just a pleasure to have half an hour to chat about it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mish, for that. And actually, when we were preparing these episodes, and actually talking about the topic itself, we chose the title of systemic leadership, which is actually something that you've been doing under your umbrella of enterprise coach, and you've been doing it under training coaches and trainers to actually facilitate this systemic work for over a decade and a half now, or more, maybe more. And actually, I believe that it is something that you mentioned. It's something related to the 21st century leadership. So I want you to just brief, our audience today on what they expect from our discussion today.
What I think is that like I was born in the 20th century. We were born in the 20th century, and it was like the kind of dominant way of thinking was there's like somebody who knows and somebody who's going to take us there. And like people were going to the moon for the first time, and there was this like wonderful flow of technology, and there was a sense of order and direction, and a sense of it's always going to get better. And those of us who survived till the 21st century have kind of discovered, well, you know what? We were kind of using up non-renewable resources to do that. And we kind of actually have to all live together, not just all the people, which is hard enough, but the planet as well. And I think that's given us challenges for leadership, because leadership, the term basically starts talking about direction, about kind of going forward. And I think what we've really seen, particularly in the last 2 years, is that like, which way is forward is becoming a little less obvious. And who is leading is becoming a little less obvious. So it's not a very pretty message, because the 20th century leadership model, I think, was very heroic. Like, we know we're going to get better, everything's going to be fine. I think in this century, it's like, well, perhaps we don't know as much as we thought. And perhaps we need to involve all of our people a bit more than we did in the last century. And that's actually quite vulnerable making for me as a leader, and I think for most of the leaders I work with. So that's where I want to kind of delve over the next 20 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
Well, that's you've mentioned two really highlights that actually, there are bulbs coming up here. When you started with the usage of the non-renewable energies, and and how people used to get to win and actually to grow, and actually to, and it was something like, and then linking that with the heroic nature of leaders in this century. And now that we want to sustain this, it's not as easy as it started. What brought us, in the success factors of the are actually being depleted in a way. And now we were in a way that we are looking at a new way of leadership that is more inclusive, that's not less heroic, and less, that's really a different perspective for me. So tell me more about it.
Yeah.
I'm
I mean,
just bend the knee.
yeah, just thinking about this, preparing for this call, I was thinking, in some ways, it's quite easy to do one or the other. To kind of give direction, which is part of leadership, obviously, to give direction. It's relatively easy. There's a lot of work, but many of us on this call, I think, are people who understand something about project management, about direction, about building something up with standards and iterating to get it better. And there's a whole body of knowledge that really was built, a lot of it was built in the 20th century, around how to build things successfully, logically, to have reproducible frameworks, and therefore to give direction with a certain amount of solid data to back you. And we've gotten so much better with data, with big data in the 21st century. So like we have much more sophisticated data now too. So I sort of think heroic direction giving leadership is relatively easy. There's a whole lot of steps and you have to learn. And I'm sure many people on this call are in the middle of learning and practicing that kind of leadership. I also think it's relatively easy to lead in an inclusive way if you abandon the direction. And you and I were chatting just before this, we started, about how it's quite easy to be nice, so long as you don't have to get somewhere. And I think certainly in this part of Africa, that's very common. We're kind of coming out of a colonial heritage and this heritage in our businesses of like top-down leadership. So we kind of, new leaders come and they say, we want to hear all the voices and we want to really care for everybody. And it's a beautiful initiative. Just like the direction-giving initiative is beautiful. But often the people I know who are in leadership who try to be really kind and inclusive, they don't get so much done.
Oh.
So my point being, it's relatively easy to be one, to make space and hear all voices and be inclusive. It's also relatively easy to be the other, to be driving, directive, have a plan, execute on the plan. What is super hard, I think, is to mix those two together. And that's what I think 21st century leadership is all about.
Oh, so you're thinking about the polarity, that's I'm sorry to relate this to parenting, that every parent needs to do with their children, being firm and kind.
I mean, I think it's a great kind of getting to the essence of it. It's like, it's not just being firm, because there's also something about heroic leadership that's visionary. But where I got stuck with this is like, I can be visionary. I love being visionary. It's cool. But my experience as a CEO was, in the end, it added up to 100 people following my vision. And if I had wanted to grow that business to 1,000 people, it wouldn't have been good enough, or 10,000 people, to just have them following my vision. They needed to be following their visions. And that's a whole lot more complicated, because now we haven't got just one vision any longer. And what I was good at as a CEO was managing managers and having them execute. So I was very much a 20th century CEO. And I did at least half of my, 2/3 of my CEOing in the 20th century and 1/3 in the 21st. So it's all very well to have a great vision and get people following you. And we have, history is littered with this in business as well as in public life. But now we've got this problem of we have to collaborate. And that's true in business as well as in between countries and between communities. and we have to collaborate with people we basically disagree with or are competing with. And that's where it gets messy. And so it's more than firm, it's firm and visionary, and it's more than kind. And that's, I think, what's super interesting about the kind side is what I'm seeing more and more is, and I teach people how to hear all voices. What I'm seeing more and more is, again, it's relatively easy to teach people to do that. But what they all say is, but what about when some of those voices I really don't want to hear? And I don't know how that lands for you, Mohammed, but that's like, to me, that's like, how do we deal with the ones we don't want to hear?
I'm actually I'm reflecting on situations I passed through and I saw with many leaders that that maybe wisdom always is in these voices and including these voices, and it always happens that after the situations happen and the misencounter happens with these voices that we may feel competing against are actually coming in rough with us. In a way, it has wisdom that we have to attend to,
That's
and
the
it is
basic
our
thing.
biggest lesson. It comes in as the biggest lesson.
I agree. I agree. And that's what I say, and you're mentioning the people who work with me in the region. That's what we talk about. What I think is cool in this conversation, which is sort of more open-ended and not a training conversation, is like, yeah, so what happens as those wise and difficult disruptive voices progress through the life of a business? Because what I see often happens is we have moments when we listen to them, and then we kind of go, like, that's an inconvenient voice, and we make a decision to go in a certain direction, and then the other voices kind of get marginalized. And I think that's something that we don't grapple with quite enough. The sense that if you talk to individual employees, they're typically only bringing like 45% of themselves to work because of some decision that was made sometime in the last 3 months or 3 years where they felt marginalized. And they're like, okay, well, I'll still come to work, and I'll still, if it's in political life, I'll still be a citizen. But I won't really believe in this project anymore because they didn't listen to me back then. And they don't really care about me. And that's the inconvenient truth, I think, is that people like me tell people to go listen, and people like you tell people to go listen to their people. But to really get to that, I think it's quite hard.
It's really a very harsh. I used to be one of these, bugging voices, this naggy voices that started, when I started as an employee in the beginning. I was really naggy, and I was really a pain, and for managers. I really had this, disruptions with manager. I was very disruptive. I had my difficulties. I was actually for the first 3 or 4 managers. However, after time, I learned how to be politically as an employee, to align, to be more lenient, to understand how to conform with many and actually take my political stances and start putting my influence in a different way instead of voicing it out, like as if I'm safe and I can speak anything and I can be heard. Actually, it caused me problems in the beginning. And then I learned my way into corporate politics, and this was another maturity. But becoming a leader and dealing with these voices, this was my actually story for the last 7 years or something, when I'm actually facing, the demons, of my shadow, or the place that actually the all what I'm denying is actually coming to me as voices, who look like me when I started working in the beginning. so
Wow, thank you for that story. Actually, I have a very similar story from my first job. I was working in Zimbabwe at the time, and my boss was a very traditional man, a traditional African man who was quite authoritarian. And so we, just like you, I was just a thorn in his side. And I was there for nearly 10 years. And at the end, at my farewell, he said, something like, well, Mish is very disruptive, but I began to realize he had the best interests of the organization at heart. So he had softened. But I have to admit that I had softened too in the way you described, that I was like, our boss is a bit authoritarian, but he actually has the best interests of the organization at heart. So I suppose it's a success story of what we're talking about, of here having disruptive voices and adapting to include them in some way.
Wow. So, do you consider this a journey that is easy?
I think, I mean, what I'm seeing the most at the moment is the splitting off into these two directions. It's very obvious the splitting back to the 20th century, and the people who try to be too kind, and then they get kind of freaked out and they just kind of come down with a hammer and they say, here's how it's going to be. I see that a lot, but I also see the opposite a lot, that people who come on courses with me or get coached by me, and they kind of get a little bit too nice. And then the young you and the young me that needed to actually butt heads with authority and come to an accommodation. When it's too nice, we just kind of splinter, and there's too many voices. And that's what I think is just such an awkward reality, because hasn't got the heroism of like, just embrace all voices. It's like, embrace all voices and then have a robust conversation about the way forward. That's where I think the growth area is for us as leaders.
So, embrace all voices and get the robust way of moving forward. That's, it's really an impressive statement. And it's actually, I'm visualizing while you're telling, how the dynamic is happening. But
Yeah,
I believe it needs a very courageous leader and a very safe space for everyone to feel, to have this happening.
I think so. I was thinking about where I've seen it work better or worse. One of the places it didn't work too well was an organization that came out of the combination of the authoritarian heritage of the United States and of India, interestingly. So it was a US multinational that spun off its Indian branch, which then became its own multinational. And I met them halfway in Europe. And they were wanting to upgrade the creativity and innovation of their people. And so they hired people, people like you and me, because we're good at that. We're good at getting all the voices out and therefore empowering people so that they bring their full selves, so that the organization becomes more innovative. All very well, except at the end of day one of the bosses watched a bit of what we were doing in the room and said, people are making mistakes here. That's not okay. And I said, but hang on, we said we were going to do innovation. If we're going to do innovation, we have to make mistakes. We can't. The whole point of innovation is to try things and sometimes fail. So I kind of shut the boss down in the room. But the boss went around that evening. It was an offsite. Went around that evening and basically held a couple of informal meetings with key players where they were roasted for showing mistakes in front of the other people during the day. And the next day, the whole thing was basically dead in the water. So that was the 20th century's grasp holding us back. Where I've seen more success is also an authoritarian environment, an oil refinery here in Africa. So oil refinery, engineering department, technical services division, hundreds of engineers running around this multi-billion oil refinery, highly technical, highly structured, really good project management skills. And then they started adopting some of the stuff that you and I speak about. Like they said, you know what, we're good at project management, but we're not good at including all our people. And there was a wholeheartedness with which they embraced that. And they kept kicking back at me and saying, with subcontractors, the only thing subcontractors understand is a size 10 boot. And I would say, well, maybe you could design that they understand a few other things and that you talk to them in a few other ways. And they were like, I'm not sure. But they started certainly with their colleagues to use the boot a lot less. And they started to see performance rising. And they started having teams of all women engineers running the refinery over the weekend as a collaborative team. And there was a kind of a brightness in their eyes and an excitement of like, oh, we're not exactly abandoning the boot, but we are softening and listening more than we used to.
Wow. So when they started listening, the performance went higher.
I think it did. And I think it, as I say, what I liked about them was that they kept up the voice of performance and the voice of direction. They didn't let it go. So what I think I'm really saying is don't listen to people like the two of us and kind of abandon all the order and directiveness and logic of your business and just go, oh, now we're going to have excessive democracy and everything's just going to become soft and fluffy. I think where the sweet spot is where you hold these two things together. And it is a bit like mixing oil and water, but you hold these things together anyway. You hold the performance targets, you hold the clear intention to improve the business and improve the lives of the people affected by the business. And as you said so wisely, and remember that when we're talking about how to do that, the weird voices, the disruptive voices, the difficult to hear voices are going to have the wisdom we need for the next changes that we don't even know about yet.
Wow. That's really profound, Mish. And actually, I believe it's a journey. And what you are saying about here, the moving, this 20th century mentality that is holding us back, and moving to the 21st century, it is a transformation, I guess. And I believe that it's not about just, trusting that the new generations will do it. It's about learning how to do it and implementing this on generational aspects, because our generation trusted power that came in from the 20th century, and we learned most of the literature we are learning and the MBAs we are taking are still based on the 20th century models.
I think that's really important that you acknowledge that we say here in South Africa that, we've got this terribly divided history that we all grappling with. But the one thing that unites us is that every single different tradition that makes up the Rainbow Nation has an authoritarian strand to it. So whether, whatever color we are, whatever ethnic group we belong to, our grandparents were authoritarian. It's the one thing we have in common. And you're so right that that's what we've inherited. And I guess for good reason. That's what I'm trying to honor, that there's a good reason why we have that. But we have this world that is just too complicated for any one authority to have all the answers.
Oh. So it's a journey, I guess. And I believe that I'm trying to look at the perspective that you are telling here, that for some good reason this is happening.
Mm.
And it has many to contemplate on.
Yes, it's irritating in a way, because I would rather, I've grown up like you. We both in our first jobs we were troublemakers, right? So I've grown up to saying those bosses are up to trouble, and now I'm one of them. So now I have to be a bit more empathetic. What I was reflecting on this and thinking, what does it take for everyone who's listening to this, who's no doubt grappling with some version of the same thing? I think we've both been talking about vulnerability. To some extent, you have to acknowledge you don't have all the answers. I think it also takes willingness to grapple with issues of power. Certainly in the southern part of Africa, There's a lot of concern about that. There's a lot of like, so much power has been abused so badly by so many colonialists as well as post-colonial business and political rulers that people are like wary of power. But actually, we need power. Power is the ability to do work. It's the most fundamental, useful thing in the world. Then I think we also need creativity, and that's non-linear, right? Creativity comes when when you and I meet across the continent, when we chat to somebody on a street corner, when we break something at work, and by breaking it, we realize we could change the machine or change the production process. So I'm kind of bouncing between the two sides of the thing. Vulnerability on the one side, power on the other. Creativity is more on this more delicate side, I think. On the power side, I think there's discipline. I don't think our continent is particularly good at discipline. And I hate discipline. So I belong here. I fit in very well here. But I actually think we need it. And it's a really hard one to sell. But I don't know what you think, but I think it's part of the mix.
It's really يعني both are seemingly polarities,
Yeah.
and actually how it was resolved in other communities may be good for these communities and for these cultures. And I believe that for each and every local culture, it has to evolve when accepting to formulate something that is relevant to both of them, to acknowledge both of them at the same time. We can just import systems, from that maybe had the power to do them and just do them as they are.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And of course, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And this is maybe part of the conflict that we are having here in local companies, even I'll tell in the local community and politics, that people want to import ready-made solutions who embrace both as they are from their global context to our local contexts.
Yes.
And it creates resistance because this doesn't look like our way of embracing vulnerability and power. It doesn't
Yes.
look to our way in embracing creativity and discipline. We want to do it our way. And here comes a struggle between, and then they tell that you are traditionalist. Then they start labeling you are neo-modernism, you are traditionalist, you are fundamentalist, And here
Yeah.
we throw names at each other, when we're trying to embrace, things the way we want to embrace it. We want to evolve to our learning process versus we want this is a ready-made solution, just implement it. This is how, modern nations are doing it. You just do it, without looking
Right.
at the sides
Right.
of these cultures.
It's another colonialism when you do that, and that doesn't really work very well. So yeah, I love what you're saying about and it immediately embraces complexity, doesn't it? Because it's like, so there's something there that makes us attracted to this thing that somebody else is doing. How does that translate into our world? What does that mean for us here with the mix and the diversity that we have in our community or our team or our organization? That's a hard conversation. And I suppose what we've been creating in this call is that the kind of atmosphere where that conversation might happen, where what I've noticed, there's a lot of curiosity in this conversation we're having, and a lot of willingness to go slow in order to go fast, in the sense of exploring a couple of different possibilities rather than just grabbing the answer and, like you said, trying to implement it as if it's a sort of a turnkey solution. I think that's really helpful. And I still don't want to reject the voice of those who say, but sometimes we need speed, and for speed, we need a blueprint. So just want to acknowledge even that has its own complexity.
Yeah. So it's I believe that we are on top of our 30 minutes, and we are in the in the peak of opening a new potential to this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So if we want to do another episode with you, Mish, are you okay with that? So
Absolutely. If people are interested, this is a subject dear to my heart, and
so
both
how we
from my
are.
leadership experience and my coaching experience, it's of real interest.
Thank you. So, how long will it be? Maybe after 2 weeks, after 1 month? What's your preference? So that we can promise our audience here for another episode together to
What would you
continue
like?
this amazing
What would
discussion.
you like?
It's
Right now?
I'm available. Just 2 weeks is okay.
What is it now? The 2 weeks, I think. Just need to check my diary.
Okay.
There's a week when I'm going to be away in a remote place, and my data connection is mobile data, which is not 100% reliable. So it might be 2 weeks or it might be 4 weeks. Let me just check when I'm going to be away.
Let's check that after the broadcast. So I believe that we owe our audience maybe to continue this amazing discussion. It's so heated here, and there's still some potential to go on.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
And really to invite people listening to send us your questions, because that'll guide us to bring this down to earth in the way that's most useful to you.
There was somebody, Mai Basal was actually, Mayuya Basal was saying, actually, she was really liking how we are wrapping up the presentation, and they were acknowledging, they were fans. They're liking, putting hearts, and, and they are actually, they're in the place of, receiving. So thank you, Mish, for this amazing episode. And I would like you to have something like 1 or 2 minutes to to explain how you deliver this systemic leadership perspective and support leaders to come into the 21st century. How do you do this as an external coach consultant? What kind of experience do they take when working with you?
Well, I guess I work with people at every level. So work with individual leaders as a coach, as a leadership coach, and I meet people online mostly these days, and grapple very much with how the very much the inner and the outer journey of becoming a successful systemic leader. I also work with teams a lot, and that the measures of success are a little different there, because it's a lot about how is this team evolving and less about how is each individual evolving, and the attention is on the team culture, and it's often to deliver some kind of culture change, to be more innovative or to be more inclusive or to be more reliable, whatever is the issue for that particular team. And then I do from time to time like large scale projects where the whole organization wants to transform. And then it's typically a team of people like myself working with a team from that organization. And there's all the complexity of the different departments and the different interest groups. And how does HR relate to this? And how does the CEO relate to this? And how does the CFO relate to this? And the project managers. And it's a wonderful experience of systemic work, because as we've been discussing, to have a whole system change and become more successful and productive involves a massive amount of complexity. And that's what I love doing. So enterprisecoach.co.za gives you the kind of basics, and the email address on the crawler over there is the way to get in touch if you're interested. And I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, Mish. And actually, we're receiving more and more acknowledgements. Again, Mai, she is actually acknowledging my my comment on her comment. And there is Jared Pretorius. Thank you for looking forward for the next part of this conversation. So maybe we'll arrange something else after we end the broadcast.
And once again, big thanks to you for really stitching together the two ends of this continent, is what I see you doing. Looking at the names as well. People from north, south, east, west, coming together and starting to talk about the things that really matter to us. So many thanks to you.
Thank you, Mish. And it was an amazing conversation. Thank you for that. Looking forward to the next episode. Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.